We're going to unravel the layers of faith woven throughout history. Is your politician a wife beater? Now that may sound like a loaded question, but there are groups moving into neighborhoods wanting to practice their vigilante type of law inside of that neighborhood, and ultimately women are the victims. We're going to be talking about Sharia law today.
Today's question of the day, which will be answered at the end of the program, is how many people in the United States believe in God?
Is your politician a wife beater, or better yet, are they in favor of allowing wife beating? Think of it. If the Bloods or Crips or the MS-13 gang takes over a neighborhood, should they be allowed to practice their own clandestine laws, some of which result in women being raped or treated as property? If the KKK, mafia, or drug cartels take over a community, should they be allowed to practice their own vigilante mob justice, where in many cases women are the victims? Well, believe it or not, some politicians are wanting to do exactly that. There is a growing movement among politicians and liberal judges to allow immigrants to move into communities and practice their own set of laws in exchange for kickback campaign contributions or promises of votes come re-election time. This is what's going on right now, as the Attorney General's office and the American Bar Association have indicated that they are considering defending Sharia law. As of June of 2011, there were 50 cases in 23 states regarding Sharia law. Some citizens, wanting to preserve traditional American freedoms, are wanting politicians to take the pledge to protect the innocent. This pledge would be not to take campaign contributions, bribes, or kickbacks in the form of promises of political support from groups which espouse, promote, or defend beliefs and traditions which are antithetical to the freedoms and equality and spirit of the Declaration of Independence, which says all men are created equal, and the original Republican Party platform of 1856, which stated as its purpose to prohibit those twin relics of barbarism, slavery, and polygamy. This pledge would read something like this: wife beating. I pledge to stand against groups, traditions, and political systems which allow a man to beat his wife if she disobeys him. Now, this is part of Sharia law. In the book, What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran, it goes through these different verses, but the one verse is Surah 4:34, and it says that if a wife disobeys the husband, he can beat her. And the imams on Memory TV, you can watch online, and you can see the imams being interviewed. And the imam says, in this verse, Allah honors the woman. And the interviewer says, how is this honoring to the woman? And the imam says, well, Allah instructs not to beat the woman on the face, just elsewhere on her body. In this way, he is showing honor to the woman. Now, you and I would probably take a disagreement to that. We don't believe that women should be beaten at all. Yet the Sharia law tries to say, well, you like to spank your kids and not have the government intervene. This is sort of our version of that. We like to be able to spank our wives and beat our wives. And so this would be a pledge that politicians would take, saying, we're not going to allow groups to come into the neighborhood and set up their own vigilante type of Cosa Nostra laws that says we can beat wives. So what would be the second part of this pledge to protect the innocent? Well, like that 1856 original Republican Party platform, to eliminate the twin relics of barbarism, polygamy, and slavery. Well, polygamy. I pledge to stand against groups, traditions, and political systems which allow a man to have more than one wife. Now, obviously, this was faced by America in the middle to late 1800s when there was some groups in Utah that were wanting to say they could have multiple wives, some as many as 19. and claimed that it was part of a religious belief, and our government said, no, sorry, we're not going to allow religious belief to be a cover for this type of sexual immorality. And so this would be the situation. Now, in Sharia law, Muhammad got a verse from Allah that says, marry women of your choice 2, 3, or 4. This is Surah 4:3. And so I think it's sort of interesting. It doesn't even give you the option of 1. It just starts off with 2, 3, or 4. But also there's another verse that says you can marry as many as your right hand possesses. You can take as many women as your right hand possesses. So in a sense, you have 4 women that have the status of wife, but you can have lots of slave wives and concubines and so forth. And so this pledge would say, I pledge to stand against any group or tradition that allows a man to have more than 1 wife. Well, punishment for rape. I pledge to stand against groups and traditions and political systems which allow the whipping, stoning, or inflicting of corporal punishment on a woman who has been a victim of rape. Now, for us in the West, that may seem like an oxymoron. It's like, wait a second, she's a victim of rape. Why would you want to punish her? Well, that's what Sharia law says. Sharia law says that if a woman is raped, she also gets whipped 100 times for allowing herself to be used as a tool of Satan to tempt the man. So, unfortunately for that woman, she not only gets the terrible crime of a rape being committed against her, but she also gets whipped by the government. And this is in effect. In May of 2011, in Pakistan, a 14-year-old girl was raped by her uncle. When the police found out about it, they arrested the girl, and they whipped her, and she died after the 80th whip. And so this is Sharia law. This is this vigilante justice, sort of like if the drug cartels take over a city in Mexico and they want to be the new law there. This is these different Muslim immigrants that want to practice this, that take over a neighborhood, that say, we're going to put into effect Sharia law. And there are countries in Europe where communities have been taken over. So what else would this pledge to protect the innocent have? Well, dress. I pledge to stand against groups, traditions, and political systems in which a woman not wearing a particular dress or covering in public is subject to discrimination, threats, and violence. And so, sure enough, there are women in Sweden that are not Muslim, but they're putting on veils because they don't want to be raped. The blonde girls in Sweden are dyeing their hair brown and black so that they won't be targeted for rape. Some of them have actually, these girls as a side business have developed a sort of like a chastity belt to protect them that takes 2 hands to take off, that at least gives them a chance to hit the attacker. But this is what's going on in Sweden. The #1 crime in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark is rape, and it's usually against European women, and it's usually from Muslim immigrant men. And so who do they target for this crime? They target women who are not covered, not veiled. Matter of fact, in Holland, if there is a Dutch woman and she's not veiled, the Muslim men call her whore, and they yell that out. And so here, this pledge would say, we are going to stand against those traditions, those political systems, which punish a woman or puts her in harm's way if she's not veiled or covered. Well, what would this pledge also contain? Sex slavery. I pledge to stand against groups, traditions, and political systems which allow involuntary marriages. I was recently in Virginia, and I spoke to 300 pastors, and they had a congressman and other leaders there. And afterwards, I was approached by an Egyptian pastor, a Coptic Christian pastor from Egypt. And he says that Muslim imams are offering money, houses, cars to Muslim men who will kidnap a Christian girl from a Christian family and stick her away into a Muslim marriage so she'll never see her family again. And if the parents go down to the police and complain, they arrest the parents. And so this is an involuntary marriage. This TCT program was aired via satellite, and a person in San Diego saw it who's Egyptian and watches the Arabic TV stations, and he said that there was a case in early of 2011 where a Muslim went into a Coptic Egyptian Christian's home, threw him and his son out, and decided to take the home and take the wife and the virgin daughter that happened to be in the home. And when the man went to the police to complain, the police said, "Oh, you're a kafir infidel. Everything you have belongs to the Muslims." So here, this wife and this virgin daughter were forced into sex slavery, forced into an involuntary marriage. And this is what we see that in this pledge, the pledge to protect the innocent, that politicians in America are facing this situation where there are different communities that are allowing Muslims to move in and then practice their Sharia law inside of their community. And this is a pledge that says, wait a second, we're not going to allow the Bloods and the Crips and the MS-13 to come in and once they take over a neighborhood say, okay, you can practice your law there. We're not going to allow the KKK or the mafia or the different drug cartels to move into a neighborhood and take it over and say, okay, we're now in charge, and our government says, oh, well, you've taken over the neighborhood, well, I guess you can have your own law. There are actually 700 neighborhoods around Paris that the police will not even protect you if you go in there because the Muslims have taken it over, and they have so taken it over that if you are a non-Muslim and you go in there and a crime's committed, there's no witnesses. And so we're seeing that there's a pledge for politicians in America to take, the pledge to protect the innocent. This pledge would also contain age of consent. I pledge to stand against groups, traditions, and politicians which allow a man to marry a woman who is under the age of consent. And of course, Sharia law, which is trying to follow the example of Muhammad. What Muhammad permitted is permitted, that's called halal. What Muhammad did not permit is not permitted, that's called haram. So Muhammad permitted to marry underaged girls. His favorite wife was Aisha. She was 6 years old when he engaged her and 9 years old when it was consummated, according to the hadith. And so there are in Islam men who have, they're 40 or 50 years old and they might have a teenage girl, or they might kidnap young girls from India where they actually can buy them because they're sold into slavery, and they're put into these underage marriages. Another part of this pledge to protect the innocent would be divorce. I pledge to stand against groups, traditions, and political systems which facilitates men divorcing their wives without due process of American law, such as simply by saying, I divorce you. Now, this is part of Sharia law, where if the man, he has his 4 wives, and if he's displeased with one of his wives, he can simply say, I divorce you. She's out the door with nothing. It's over. They say that's why in many Muslim countries the women wear lots of gold jewelry, because if they're not let back into the house, they at least have what they're wearing. This pledge would also have alimony. I pledge to stand against groups, traditions, and political systems which deny alimony to a woman who has been divorced without due process of law. So if a man says, I divorce you, and she's out the door, she has no rights to any alimony. And there were cases in America where a Muslim man wanted to divorce his wife and wanted to do it under the Islamic law. And thankfully, the American judge says, I'm sorry, you're in America, you have to pay alimony. But there are cases in Europe where they have their communities, whether it's the Turkish Muslims in Germany, and they want to be able to. And then in England, even the Archbishop of Canterbury made comments that Sharia law should be allowed in Britain. And so in these neighborhoods where the Muslims have taken it over, that they should be allowed to divorce their wives and not have to submit to the laws of Britain. Visiting rights. I pledge to stand against groups, traditions, and political systems which deny a woman who has been divorced access to her own children without due process of American law. Now, what does that mean? Well, in Islamic law, in Sharia law, which again, they want to take over neighborhoods, that if the woman is divorced, and again, all the man has to say is, I divorce you, she's out the door. She has no access to her own children. It's over. And so it's a very heart-wrenching situation. And in America, we have laws that if there's a divorce and it goes through the due process of law, there's visitation rights. And so, again, should the MS-13 or the Bloods and the Crips or the KKK, if they take over a neighborhood, should they be allowed to practice their own law? Well, that's the situation we're facing today with Sharia law in many neighborhoods. We're going to be right back in a minute and finish the pledge to protect the innocent. In the book, What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran, it takes you step by step through history, and you get to see all the areas that Muslims have advanced and taken over communities. And when they take over a community, they establish laws. These laws govern behavior for the people that live there. And it just so happens that women and non-Muslims are put into a second-class status position. People say, well, what do you mean? Well, it's very similar to after the Civil War in some of the states in the Deep South. Of course, it was the Republican Lincoln that was the anti-slavery party. But some of the Democrat Party in the South, they passed Jim Crow laws and black codes, which relegated freed slaves to a second-class status. And as long as they kept their position in society, they were allowed to exist. But if they ever wanted to be equal, they could expect vigilante justice or lynchings or killings or mobs. And so it was this situation where they did not have justice. And we're ashamed that this happened in America, and we repent of it. But this is exactly the way that Christians and Jews and non-Muslims and women are treated in Muslim countries where they're practicing Sharia law. So we're talking about Sharia law. We're talking about Sharia law coming into America. And it first starts with the immigrants coming in, and they're nice, and they're genuinely nice. And people say, they're nice, I met one, let more in. More come in, they get an imam. And the imam teaches them to follow the Quran closer and begin to start practicing Sharia law in their neighborhoods. And as it grows, that's when people feel uncomfortable and leave. And when they take over the neighborhood, they say, hey, the police can't arrest the whole community, so we're just going to practice our own version of Sharia law. And so it's very similar to if the drug cartels moved in, if the gangs, the Bloods and the Crips, or the MS-13 moves into a neighborhood, or maybe some communities where the KKK or different groups would take over, and they say, okay, we're now in charge. And imagine if our government said, oh, you're in charge now? Okay, well, we'll back off. And matter of fact, we'll have the ACLU and the American Bar Association defend your right to practice your vigilante justice in your community. Well, that's what's happening. And so one of the suggested solutions is to have politicians take a pledge to protect the innocent. And this would be a pledge to protect so that women would not be beaten by their husbands, that there would not be polygamy practiced in the communities, that a woman who's been raped would not also be punished and whipped. Well, one of the pledges to protect the innocent would include the kidnapping of children. So I pledge to stand against groups and traditions and political systems which facilitates a father taking a woman's children to another country which has laws denying her rights to her own children. And that is something that is a practicality that actually exists, where Muslim men will come to America and marry a woman, and then they have children, and then they'll go back for a visit back to Pakistan and take the kids and the wife, and once they get back there, the wife has no rights to the kids. And if the man divorces her, she's out on her own. I actually spoke in the high school in north central Missouri, where there was a Muslim teacher, and he did marry a Muslim woman and went back to Pakistan, and the woman had no rights to her children over there. And it was turned into a movie that Sally Fields starred in, and it was Not Without My Children, and if I had the title correct. But, and so this would be a pledge to say we're not going to allow that in our neighborhoods. We're not going to allow a political group to bribe politicians, promising contributions or kickbacks of votes in exchange for politicians allowing for this clandestine law. No equality for women. This would be another part of this pledge to protect the innocent. I pledge to stand against groups, traditions, and political systems which teach that men are more equal before the law than women. Wow. Well, who would teach that in America today? Well, those groups in those neighborhoods where they teach Sharia law. And Muhammad said that a woman's mind was deficient, so that it took 2 women to testify in court against 1 man. A woman gets half the inheritance that a man gets. And so in Islamic law, the women are not equal before the men, not equal with the men before the law. Now, there's a little bit of a interesting way that this is tried to be defended. They say, well, we're all equal before Allah or God, and but the equality is a woman is supposed to be an Islamic woman, and the man is expected to be an Islamic man. Now, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about equality before the law right here in this life, in our communities in America. To say, oh, well, they're both equal in their sense of, you know, in their standing before Allah to fulfill what their role is. No, we're not talking about that. We're talking about laws in America. Laws that say that it takes one person to stand in a particular place. Well, a man is equal to the woman in that case. So this pledge would be to say that I'm not going to defend or promote a political system or a tradition that says that men are more equal than women. Name calling. This would be a part of that pledge. I pledge to stand against groups, traditions, and political systems which call any race of people apes or pigs, or women who are not covered whores. And you talk to people who've been in Europe, this is a common thing that Muslim men call European women who are not covered, they call them whores. And of course, Jews are called apes and pigs. This is part of a tradition, and that tradition is incorporated into Sharia law. Death threats. Part of the pledge to protect the innocent would be, I pledge to stand against groups, traditions, and political systems which issue death threats on someone for leaving their faith community. And this is typical of gangs, where if you join the Bloods or the Crips or the MS-13 or some of these gangs, if you leave that gang, you get killed. And if you leave that gang and join another gang, you'll get killed. And so this is part of the Islamic laws called the Ridda laws, R-I-D-D-A, where you're free to join Islam, but if you ever leave, there's the death penalty. And it's in the Hadith al-Bukhari, and in Egypt, it is illegal to change religions. And another part of this pledge, killing of wives and children. I pledge to stand against groups, traditions, and political systems which effectively provide cover for a man to kill his wife or children who embarrass him before his faith community. Now, they'll say, well, this is not actually part of the law, but this is part of their traditions. And if a man feels like his daughter is dressing too Western, he'll kill her, like what happened in Texas, where a man shot his 2 daughters to death in the back of a taxi cab, or a man up in upstate New York who ran over his daughter because she was dressing too Western, or the man who had a television program called Bridges TV, and his wife put out a restraining order on him, and he beheaded her. And so this is a system that gives cover. It says it's not really bad, and they shouldn't be punished a whole lot for that, and so they sort of get their hand slapped, and then they're back out living their lives. Corporal punishment. The pledge. I pledge to stand against groups, traditions, or political systems which cut off parts of a person's body for punishment for a crime. This is Sharia law. In Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh, they have the Dira Square, the Chop Square. And every week they gather there and they cut off parts of arms and legs of people who have been accused of thievery or so forth. And so this is Sharia law. This is what groups do, and they move into a community and they begin to practice it a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, until finally the full implementation has happened. We'll be back for some closing comments.
Now, Here's the answer to the question of the day. How many people in the United States believe in God? A 2003 Harris poll reported 90% of Americans believe in God. A 2007 Gallup poll reported 9 in 10 Americans believe in God. A 2007 Newsweek poll reported 91% of Americans believe in God. A 2004 Fox News poll reported 92% of Americans believe in God. The USA Today, February 25, 2008, published results of the Pew Forum's U.S. Religious Landscape Survey that reported only 1.6% of Americans are atheist. President Dwight Eisenhower stated February 20, 1955, quote, "Without God, there could be no American form of government, nor an American way of life. Recognition of the Supreme Being is the first, the most basic expression of Americanism." Unquote.
What every American needs to know about the Quran is a book that covers a lot of what we're talking about today. But a pledge for politicians to take to prevent any group from coming in to their community and passing new clandestine laws. One of them would be no honesty. I pledge to stand against groups, traditions, and political systems which advocate lying to gain access into a group, then using their membership and financial contributions to subvert the group into not opposing them. And so that's taqiya, sacred lying, holy deceit. You're allowed to lie if you can help advance your agenda. Genocide. I pledge to stand against groups, traditions, and political systems that advocate exterminating ethnic groups, such as Jews in the state of Israel or Africans in the southern Sudan. And finally, a pledge of allegiance. I pledge to stand against groups, traditions, and political systems which hold disdain or discourages American citizens from pledging allegiance to the flag. Well, should wife beating be allowed in your community? Should the Bloods, Crips, or MS-13 gang be allowed to practice their own clandestine laws if they take over the neighborhood? Should the KKK, mafia, or drug cartels be allowed to practice their own vigilante mob justice if they take over a community? And should the American Bar Association and the Attorney General's office defend them? Well, the question of whether Sharia law should be allowed to be practiced might be answered easily enough if politicians took the pledge to protect the innocent. Well, again, this is in the book, What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran, A History of Islam in the United States, and we want to preserve this great land and protect the innocent. Thank you.
This has been a TCT Network exclusive production. If you would like to see more exclusive special programs, send your support to TCT, P.O. Box 1010, Marion, Illinois, 62959.